Initially, you join up for aircrew, and you pass the medical. Then the key thing there was the link trainer. And that was the beast that you had to get in, and you were shown how to do it. And if your coordination was good enough and you didn't spin in and wreck yourself, and particularly when they closed the hood, then you would go on as a pilot trainee. If you flunked that, then you'd still stay in air crew, but you'd be go into the stream for navigator, bomb aim, or whatever. The link trainer was like it was a simulator built by a man by the name of Link in the States. And it was like the simulator they have today, very sophisticated. This was a stubby little machine with little wings, blue, if I remember correctly, or gray. You got into it, and it's like a cockpit. You had a control stick, you had your rudder pedals, you had basic instruments. And it was all powered, actually, I think, by air and bellows, but they could put in turbulence and so on, and they give you direction, and you'd turn. You could climb and dive and climb, and you had to watch the instruments, and you could spin and you'd crash, sort of thing. So it was and we did this all the way through. You did, because they could simulate different courses and approaches and so on, and that was part of our training to get our wings. And even when I was instructing, you had to go in the link trainer to do some procedures and so on. So it was, as I said, it was the beast that you had to overcome. That was the initial hurdle, and everybody wanted to be a pilot, but if you did that, and of course other people got washed out later because of air sickness, what have you, but that was the start of it. January the 5th, 1941 was the first time that I ever flew, and Mr. Brown was my instructor, because what they had started was flying clubs took on a contract to train, and Mr. Brown was American. And I'd like to get this point across, because with everything here, during the wartime, 8,800 Americans came up and joined the Air Force. Some of them because of connection, like Jake Robinson, very close friend from Indiana. His grandfather had been Canadian. And the Americans weren't in the war. Others came up for those reasons, but others came up because they had flying experience. They had instructors, commercial tickets, and so they came up through the underground, which was actually operated by the British Council, from New York to Montreal, from Chicago to Windsor, from Seattle to November. And without the help of the Americans, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan would have difficulty getting off the floor. And Mr. Brown was my instructor. The big thing about this is that when they came into the war in 1941, for higher pay, benefits, and so on, 2,200 went back into the Army Air Corps. They didn't have the Air Force then. Army Air Corps. 600 stayed until the end of the war in the RCF, and that's something I stressed when I'm giving some talks. We started on Yale's, which was like the younger brother of the Harvard. I had a 450 horsepower and didn't have the retractable undercarriage. And here again, you did night flying, you did aerobatics, and it was handling the faster aircraft. And you did some formation training and so on. It was to the point where you were competent. We were a little bit competitive too, because you'd have simulated dog fights, tail chases, whatever. And I guess, and you did some low flying, authorized and non-authorized. We did have a low flying area there. And this has evolved through it. The Harvard, they said if you could fly the Harvard, you could fly anything. It basically followed through. Most people that went through Harvard units training ended up as fighter pilots. Later on, depending on they did have some stations. Hagersville had both Harvards and Ansons, which was a twin-engine training plane. And they went in different streams, and some were better on the Ansons than they were in the Harvard. The Harvard was fully aerobatic, 600 horsepower. But then as you build up your time, and particularly going back as an instructor, There's a period, I think around 400 hours, that you think you're pretty good. And then something happens and you do the right things and you survive it. Another spot is between 800 and 1,000 hours. Now you really are good because you've been around, and this builds up fairly quickly. And I would say when you're instructing, you're flying. When I started instructing my first course, second course, I had 8 students. Fly an hour a day. I'm flying 8 hours a day with putting in 8 hours. And then I'm doing some night flying. So your time builds up pretty quickly. And between that 800 and 1,000, another something happens. After that, you become pretty, not careful so much as competent, and you do the things you're supposed to do. But at the same time, because you have a bit of free time, you do some things, particularly, and this is something I'll talk about, they would never do it now. But back then, we didn't have radios. And we called it instructor's weather. When the ceiling got down to 500 feet or as low as 300 feet, that was instructor's weather. 2 instructors, one would be in the back seat of the Harvard, under a hood on instruments, would do an instrument takeoff, climb up into the cloud and disappear at 300 feet, 500 feet, climb up above, meet other instructors up there, have a lot of fun up above the clouds. There's always blue skies no matter what it's like down below. And then when it's time to come back, instructor go onto the hood again and let down very carefully, 50 feet a minute. You come out over the trees and find your way back to base. And you automatically picked up points to reference where you were. And one of them was the Grand River that came down from Brantford all the way down that way. And it was the river. All you had to do was, in bad weather, flow of the river. Okay, that's what you follow down. You come to the bridge, that's Dunville, over the bridge, and a curve to the right, and then back to the left, out into Lake Erie. Well, the curve, you just kept up the curve, and that brought you right in on the runway. And that would be in a snowstorm or whatever. And so all this type of thing later on, overseas, you could fall back on all these little tricks that you learned, and you recognized, you had landmarks and so on. So that's, I don't know why there were people that were killed. We lost 47 at Dunville, but I've seen 25 planes in the circuit in a blinding snowstorm, and all you could do was straight down, and each one would get down in that bad weather because it was close to Lake Erie. I actually flew on June the 5th, and that was in the morning. And when I got back, this was Squadron 2 over in France looking for targets of opportunity. When we came back, all the other craft, they were painting the black and white stripes on and immediately got onto our aircraft, and we knew something was really happening. And they had a big open-air briefing with Air Vice Marshal Cunningham, RAF, and he was the head of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, or 83 Group, whatever it was. And basically we had that briefing, we had a wing briefing, and then a squadron briefing, and I think I got to bed about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I wanted to be on the first one, and they had picked, and so I got on a spare in case somebody, 12 aircraft, you wanted to have 12 there, and so we always had a spare take off and follow in case somebody had to turn back because of engine problem, radio, whatever. And so I think we were called at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, had a breakfast. We took off in the dark, and we were over Normandy, going over and seeing all the ships below, and we had this below patrol above the British sector and Juno Beach with the Canadian sword that was, and Juno. And that's where they patrol. Now, I stayed. I should have gone back, but I stayed, and I think I was in the air a little over an hour and something, and you were on patrol by the time it took about an hour 55. But I actually patrolled and then came back by myself, and the channel was solid with ships. There are over 7,000 ships, the big destroyers and the bombardment going on, the landing craft and the supplies all coming through. So you could almost walk across on it. And so that was really something. And then I threw 2 more trips that day. The last one, I was in the final one, we landed in the dark at about 11 o'clock at night. In the Rommel case, which happened on July the 17th, our squadron flew 2 sorties that day, one in the afternoon, and the second one took off at 6:15 in the evening. And it was late in the afternoon, and we, 12 aircraft, I'm leading one section, Jack Shepard was our CO leading another section, and Rod Smith was leading the other. As soon as we got airborne, we broke up into 3 sections of 4 looking for targets of opportunity. I flew, we're channels here, our trip is here, Con is here, river coming down. Go to the other side, and I spot this staff car coming down this highway or road with trees on either side. And you're the hunter. And the thing that I had learned from previous, that if you dipped your wings, they had a lookout. And if they saw you dip their wings, they figured that you had spotted them, and they would pull off and go in the ditch and take cover. And so I said to the section, I've got a target, keep straight and level. So we went on, and myself, my number 2, and so on. And I watched, and as the car approached an opening, I timed it to come down. My number 2 slid under, and he's off to one side, and we came down. And I strafed it down the left side, and it veered off and went into sort of the ditch. Others that claimed, one was a squadron leader, Locke, from South Africa, flying with an RAF squadron. His report was that he attacked the staff car from behind, down a wooded, you don't do that. And the other thing was that the Americans claimed that a P-47 had got Rommel. Well, as far as I was concerned, end of story. And then when later on, 24, 36 hours later, the Germans came back and said, no, it's a Spitfire. And so the guys all said, Charlie, in that spot, it had to be Rommel. The big thing was that in the reports, and this is where, and here again, it's 2-3 days, we're flying 3 times a day, end of story, and that's it. And so the big thing was that later on, the report was that Rommel had been badly injured, and he was in the hospital. And then after the war and so on, and people that did some investigation said, well, this took place, according to the Germans, between, I think it was 5:30 or 5:25 and 5:40 or 5:45. We took off at 6:15. And so I got a letter about that where they said I wasn't in there at the right time. Fine. That would be 1992. And I never wanted to make anything of it. That's fine. I didn't talk about things. Well, I had started talking about fellows I flew with, but I never talked about that. And then with research, this is where we were on double daylight time. The Germans were on, and Europe was on single daylight time. So I was in the air at the right time and so on. So it's been authenticated that I was in the right place at the right time and put Rommel in the hospital. We did a lot of dive bombing too. The Spitfire could carry 1,000 pounds of bombs, 500 under between the oleolegs legs and 250 under each wing. We dive bombed marshalling yards and bridges and so on, and we would be loaded with that and take off for targets of opportunity to, if we saw that, this is what we would do. Anything that moved was fair game. And pickings would be fairly slim at one time. Here again, I don't want to sound crass or whatever, but this was the wartime. So whatever you could do to impede the movement of troops or supplies and so on. Was going to help our effort. And we were shooting and doing so much that they questioned the numbers we were turning in, because on one sortie alone, I think I got 18 or something mechanical transport with Ed Price along with me. And because, well, didn't use a lot of ammunition. I used just my cannon, and all you needed was 3 or 4 cannon if you hit it properly. And the same with the train, if I got it properly in the boiler, because they had this cutoff of the smokestack to stop the steam coming out. They closed that off. Well, the pressure's there, and all you had to do was put 3 or 4 shells in there, and it would explode, and then you could straight the train. Yeah, and even dispatch riders. This is Rod Smith was flying with me, just the 2 of us, and I spotted this dispatch rider, and so I went down, and he saw me, and I missed him. He dodged behind some trees, and so I pull up, and I keep my eye on him, and I'm up over the top, right off the deck. I'm over the top, actually sort of doing a loop, when Rod said, "What the heck are you doing?" I said, "I've got my eye on him." And so I pulled around and came down, and this is where the dispatch rider bailed off and into the ditch, so I came back, and he had to walk from there. I got his I got his motorcycle, so he had a fair distance to walk, but that was one of the things that fair game, I guess. But in that particular case, he ended up walking. Biggest thing that has happened is that our history, our military history, has not been taught. I don't know about other provinces, but definitely in Ontario, they haven't taught the history until about 4 or 5 years ago. It started with grade 10. Now they're covering from 1900 to the year 2000 in the semester that they have. And there's a whole group of people from about the early 60s up until the late 80s that it was a denial. It was the wrong thing to even talk about. And basically, I guess, and I can say this, it probably goes back to the Trudeau area and so on, because of how he was involved and not involved. And there's a denial about it. In the Vietnam War, where there was denial in the States and people came up. The thing is that we have a very honorable and amazing military history that Canadians basically tied in with Great Britain and the Empire, very much a part of it, and this is where my father came from. And going back to the Boer War and the First World War. And the thing is, in the Second World War, we only had 11,500,000 people in Canada across this whole nation. From 1939 to 1945, 1,082,000 served in, had served, or were serving in the armed forces, almost exactly 10%, and with distinction. And this is what we did in the First World War. It was the Canadians that took Vimy Ridge. The French tried to, the British tried, and the Canadians did. In South Africa, Paardeberg, the Canadians were front and center. And this continued in the Second World War, very thing. We were in Normandy, our Canadian forces, with the third div. My brother didn't go in on the first wave, and I didn't catch up to him in, that's another whole story, in July of 44. They got the furthest and obtained their objectives. No other did, and they had to draw back, but they made their objective. And this is what they did, and it was nasty fighting all the way up through. My brother Ted never talked about his war experiences. And this is one thing that I get across, because when I came home from overseas, I went back into retailing, and Mrs. Howden came into the store. Andy Howden and I had met in grade 4, elementary, all the way through high school. I joined the Air Force. I didn't know that he joined the Air Force until I'm in Bournemouth, and I meet Sandy Borland and I knew Sandy was in, and he was a fighter pilot, had joined 416 Squadron. I had joined 412 shortly before. And we met in the main street, and he said, guess what, Charlie? Andy Howden and Howie Steen are in having lunch in the officers' mess. I'll go and get them. We'll have a picture taken. So in front of the Royal Bath in Bournemouth, there's 4 fellas from Guelph, Ontario. Andy Howden, Howie Steen, Charley Fox, and Sandy Borland. 2 came back and 2 didn't. Mrs. Howden came into the store. I went back into retailing in Guelph, Walker Stores. She started crying, came up to me and grabbed me by the shoulders, started shaking me. This would be probably January 1946, just shortly after I came back, and saying, why my Andy and not you, and started pounding me on the chest. Why my Andy and not you? And all I could do was hold her and say, Mrs. Howden, I don't know why not me. And for that reason, I didn't talk about things for 40 years. My brother Ted never talked about it. And this is a lot of veterans don't talk. Some are talking now, but don't talk because they felt guilty.